So we're obviously not really going to use this grid. This is what we're going to use. It's the pig head thing over here. So I'm going to press space 1 to go back into the perspective, or you can just do it here. Set view, perspective viewport. This is how the Voronoi graph broke up this 3D shape. It's the same principle though, same exact thing. The points are inside of it, as you can see. And they are all in charge of, they make a piece where they're, all the 3D space now is closer to that point than it is to any other point. There it is, there's the fracture, wonderful. So exploded view I'll put over to the side because we don't want to explode it before we get into the sim. So I'm just going to say we can create an assemble node instead of a pack node. Now the assemble node really is a pack node plus some other stuff, but it can be convenient to use. What it will do is it's going to create a packed piece, a packed fragment. If you remember, we talked about, or create packed geometry here. Once we turn create packed geometry on, it will look at the connectivity of the pieces, the way that the exploded view did here, to see which pieces are their own thing. If you've named them yourself, you can turn off create name attribute, and then it will use the name attribute to define what the different pieces are. If you keep it on, it will look at the connectivity of each one as if you put down a connectivity SOP, which would go through and assign a identification, this class identification, for each island of geometry, meaning geometry that's not hooked up to other geometry. Essentially a piece. Each one of these colored pieces would be one of those things. So again, to reiterate, assemble, when you turn create packed on, will create packed fragments as opposed to straight packed geometry, because this is all going to be stored in one memory location. And then each of the individual packed fragments will be kind of a sub location of it. So for all intents and purposes, it's very similar to the regular packed geometry. But now you can see geometry ID is this, and it also uses the actual name attribute to find the like sub part of it that it is. So even though these pieces are different, and it's still 1 point per piece now, same thing, 12 points, 12 primitives, 12 packed fragments, as opposed to what it was a minute ago where it was all of these points and primitives. Same thing, we can still click on a point, move it, just because it's 1 point. It's still gonna have, just like the other ones, it's still gonna have its own packed full transform that will, you can see we moved this one, so it has that new value, as opposed to if I turn this off. It's just stored memories a little bit different than the regular packed, but it's fine. Essentially, it just created a packed piece for each piece here. So we got 12 pieces. Let's create a null. We'll say, I'll call this out here. And now let's go back to our sim, or even better, I'm just going to copy our sim over because who cares? Just to keep it a little distinct here. So here's our sim. Let's change where we're reading these things in from to the thing we just made, Voronoi out. There it is. It still has that rotation and position applied, which is why we see that. I am going to turn the ground plane back on. And now when we play it, there we go. It falls into the pieces. They were never, it's important to note at this point that they were never attached to each other. They were just all falling at the same rate due to gravity at the same time. And then once they reached the ground, they all started going in different directions and colliding against each other. So it gave the impression of them breaking apart. But in reality, they were never actually attached. And we can even prove that to ourselves probably by giving it some kind of angular velocity there. So now we spun the whole thing, giving it an angular velocity, so it kind of flew apart. Using constraints, glue constraints and whatnot, as we'll get to in a moment, those will keep it actually bound together until it reaches some force that breaks it apart. But yeah, so here they are. Same thing. We can look at the guide geometry. Each one of these convex things now has its own, because they're all different pieces. Important to note that it's still considered one DOP object. It's still cool RBD, but it has the 12 points and primitives inside of it. So they're still all being simulated. You know, if we look at the geometry thing here, you know, we'll still see the positions changing. We'll see, well, we'll look at the full packed prim here, full packed transform. You know, they're all moving here on their own. They all have their own mass, they all have their own everything, just as we saw before. It's just all still contained in one object, which is essentially a container. So there you go. All of these things are convex, and everyone's happy.